So, you see, Mr. Finch. Tanisha's voice was steady, a stark contrast to the desperate tears still drying on her cheeks. I'm not asking for your charity. I am offering you an investment. The billionaire, Alistair Finch, stood speechless in his cavernous San Francisco penthouse, the checkbook he'd condescendingly pulled out now feeling like a useless, insulting toy. The black maid who cleaned his floors had just asked for a loan to save her dying mother, and then, in the same breath, had made a proposition so audacious, so brilliant, it threatened to either save his soul or destroy his entire empire. Welcome back to Epic Narrative Tales, where we give you the best heartwarming stories for your enjoyment. Please grab your blankets and your popcorn. This story is to die for.
The silence in Alistair Finch's penthouse was a physical thing. It was a perfectly curated, soundproofed silence, purchased for an astronomical sum, that clung to the minimalist furniture and vast, sterile spaces like a shroud. From his perch high above the glittering expanse of San Francisco, Alistair had effectively muted the world. He was a ghost in his own life, a man of immense wealth who had discovered too late that all the money on earth couldn't silence the ghosts that lived inside him. His only connection to the living, breathing world was the quiet, dignified presence of his maid, Tanisha. She was a woman of profound, almost severe competence. She moved through the vast, empty rooms of his home with a silent grace, her presence a steady, unobtrusive rhythm in his hollowed-out life. She cleaned his floors, polished his joyless awards, and changed the sheets on his unslept-in bed, all with a meticulous care that bordered on reverence. He knew her name, he paid her well, but he did not know her. To him she was simply the best, most efficient, and quietest part of the household machinery. Tanisha, for her part, understood the rules of this gilded cage. Mr. Finch was not a man who engaged in small talk. He was an absence, a flicker of movement in the periphery, a glass of water left on a coaster. She cleaned around his grief, around his solitude, respecting the invisible walls he had built around himself. Her own life was a world away, a life of mounting medical bills, of long, anxious phone calls to a hospital in her hometown, of a gnawing, constant fear that was the polar opposite of his empty silence. The ticking clock of her desperation was her mother, a woman of fierce faith and boundless love, now confined to a hospital bed, her body failing, her spirit fighting. A new experimental treatment was her only hope, a treatment whose cost was a number so impossibly large it felt like a cruel joke. Tanisha had been working 3 jobs, saving every penny, but she was falling desperately, hopelessly short. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while she was polishing a vast black granite countertop that reflected her own worried face back at her. It was her aunt. Her voice was strained, heavy with a sorrow she was trying to keep at bay. "The doctors need a decision by the end of the week, Tommy," her aunt said, her voice cracking. "They need the deposit to secure her spot in the program. Without it—" She didn't have to finish the sentence. The unspoken words, "we lose her," hung in the air, a final, brutal verdict. Tanisha ended the call, her hand trembling, the phone feeling impossibly heavy. She leaned against the cold granite, the sterile, silent luxury of the penthouse suddenly feeling like a personal mockery. Here she was, surrounded by a fortune so vast it was almost abstract, and she couldn't afford to save the one person who was her entire world. She had prayed, she had worked, she had exhausted every possible option. There was only one left, one final, humiliating, and terrifying door to knock on. She would have to break the first and only rule of this house. She would have to speak to the ghost. She would have to ask her billionaire employer for help. The thought of it, the shame of it, was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth, but the thought of her mother's fading smile was infinitely worse. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Finding the courage took Tanisha the rest of the afternoon. She moved through the silent, opulent rooms of the penthouse in a daze, her hands performing their familiar tasks, but her mind a raging, chaotic sea of pride and fear. To ask for a loan was to admit defeat. It was to reduce herself to a stereotype, the poor black maid with her hand out. It was a violation of the quiet, dignified code she had lived by her entire life. But the image of her mother's face, the sound of her aunt's cracking voice, they were a fire at her back, pushing her forward. She found him in his study, a vast, minimalist room with one wall made entirely of glass, offering a godlike panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. Alistair Finch sat not at his desk, but in a severe leather armchair, staring out at the fog rolling in over the Golden Gate Bridge. He didn't turn as she entered, but his reflection in the glass, a faint ghostly image, acknowledged her presence. "Is there a problem, Tanisha?" he asked, his voice a low, detached rumble. This was it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird. She clasped her hands together to keep them from trembling. "Mr. Finch," she began, her own voice a strained, unfamiliar whisper. She had to clear her throat and start again. "Mr. Finch, I would not ask this if it were not a matter of life and death. I need a loan." The words hung in the air, a raw, humiliating confession. He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, held a flicker of something she had seen before in other wealthy employers, a weary, condescending pity. He was already categorizing her, filing her away in the problems-to-be-managed drawer of his mind. "My mother," she continued, forcing the words out, the story spilling from her in a rush of desperate, fragmented sentences. "She's sick, very sick. There's a treatment, an experimental program, but it's expensive. I've saved almost everything, but I'm short. The deposit is due by Friday." She finally looked him in the eye, her own gaze a mixture of fierce pride and abject pleading. "I will pay you back every single cent, with interest. I will work for you for the rest of my life if I have to. Please." The tears she had sworn she would not shed escaped and traced a hot, shameful path down her cheek. Alistair listened, his expression unchanging. This was familiar territory. The sob stories of the help. He had heard them all. He stood, walked to his sleek minimalist desk and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook, the quiet, efficient movements of a man solving a minor, inconvenient problem. "How much is the deposit?" he asked, his tone the same one he might use to ask about the price of a stock. $50,000, she whispered, the number feeling like an obscenity in her mouth. He didn't flinch. He simply picked up a pen. It was in that single, condescending moment, the easy, dismissive way he reached for his checkbook as if he were swatting a fly, that something inside Tanisha snapped. It was the old, familiar fire of her pride, the unshakable core of her dignity rising up from the ashes of her humiliation. She was not a problem to be solved. She was not a charity case. And then she spoke her next words, the words that would change everything. "But I'm not asking for your charity," she said, her voice suddenly clear, steady, and imbued with a power that made him pause, his pen hovering over the check. He looked up, a flicker of confusion in his cool gray eyes. "So you see, Mr. Finch," Tanisha said, her voice now ringing with a strange, brilliant, and utterly unexpected authority. "I'm not asking for your charity. I am offering you an investment." Alistair Finch, the man who had built an empire on his ability to anticipate every possible angle, every possible move, was left completely, utterly speechless. He just stared at her, the checkbook in his hand now feeling like a useless, insulting toy. "An investment?" he finally managed to say, the words laced with disbelief. "Yes," she said. She took a step forward, no longer a pleading employee, but a confident equal. "You have a problem, Mr. Finch, a very expensive one. Your Finch Forward initiative, the philanthropic arm of your company, it's failing. It's throwing money at community projects, but it has no soul, no connection. Your press is terrible. People see you as a detached, cold-hearted monolith." He continued to stare, stunned into silence by her audacity. She knew this because she cleaned his office. She read the discarded memos in his trash. She listened. "I can fix it," she declared. "I know these communities. I know what they need. Not another soulless check, but a hand up, a program with a heart. Give me the $50,000, not as a loan, but as seed money. Give me a 6-month contract. Let me retool your initiative from the ground up. If I succeed, if I turn it around and generate the positive press and real-world results you want, then the loan is my signing bonus. If I fail, I will work for you for free for the next 10 years. I am not asking you to save my mother, Mr. Finch. I am giving you a chance to save your own legacy." She stood before him, her tears forgotten, her desperation forged into a sword of pure, brilliant, and audacious confidence. She had not come to him as a maid begging for a handout. She had come to him as an equal, offering him a high-stakes, all-or-nothing business proposition. She had taken her moment of ultimate vulnerability and had, in a single breathtaking move, turned it into her moment of ultimate power. And Alistair Finch, for the first time in a very, very long time, had absolutely no idea what to say next.
The silence in the study stretched for an eternity. Alistair Finch simply stared at Tanisha. His mind, a machine built for rapid-fire analysis and ruthless decision-making, struggling to process the sheer, unmitigated audacity of her proposal. He had been prepared for tears, for pleas, for gratitude. He had not been prepared for a leveraged buyout of his own charity. He thought of the ghost that haunted this very room, the memory of his late wife, a passionate philanthropist who had always accused him of having a checkbook where his heart should be. She had been the soul of his public works. Since her death, the Finch Forward Initiative had become exactly what Tanisha had described, a cold, inefficient machine that burned money with no discernible warmth. This woman, his maid, had seen the fatal flaw in his empire from the vantage point of his own trash can. It was either the most brilliant thing he had ever heard or the most insane. And in the dead, silent world he inhabited, the sheer, electrifying chaos of her proposition was the first thing that had made him feel alive in years. He put the pen down. He closed the checkbook. "You have a deal, Miss Williams," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "My lawyers will have a contract for you in the morning, but be warned, I do not invest in failures." The transition was brutal and immediate. The next morning, Tanisha was no longer Tanisha the maid. She was Tanisha Williams, the newly appointed community outreach strategist, a title so vague and corporate it felt like a costume. She was given a small, sterile office on the executive floor of Finch Enterprises, a glass box suspended in the clouds, worlds away from the quiet, honest labor she knew. Her very presence was a disruption, a question mark in a world of declarative statements. Executives in sharp suits would walk past her office, their gazes lingering with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The whispers started almost immediately. Who was she? Where had she come from? The rumor mill, starved for any gossip about the reclusive Alistair Finch, went into overdrive. Tanisha ignored it all. Her mother's treatment was secured, the $50,000 seed money wired directly to the hospital. That victory, that profound, life-altering relief, was the armor she wore against the slings and arrows of her new environment. Her partnership with Alistair was a study in tense, uncomfortable friction. He gave her a desk and a title, but he gave her no guidance. He would summon her to his office, a vast, intimidating space with a view that seemed to encompass the entire world and subject her to a barrage of sharp, probing questions. He wasn't mentoring her, he was testing her, dissecting her, waiting for her to break, to reveal the flaw in his impulsive, uncharacteristic investment. "What's your plan for the literacy program in the Bayview district?" he would demand, his tone cold and impatient. The previous director poured $1 million into it with no results. Tanisha, who had spent the last 48 hours doing nothing but researching that very program, didn't flinch. "The previous director gave them tablets, Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "He didn't give them tutors.
He didn't partner with the local church, which already has a volunteer base. He didn't ask the community what it needed. He told them what he was giving them. The problem isn't the program, it's the arrogance. Her insights were raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly accurate. She saw the human element that his army of business school graduates had completely missed. With every sharp, correct answer she gave, a fragile, tense, and deeply grudging respect began to form between them. He was a man who respected results, and she was a woman who saw the path to them with a clarity that was both infuriating and undeniably brilliant. The tension came from their proximity. She was now a constant in his life, not as a silent, invisible servant, but as a challenging, vocal partner. He was forced to see her, not as a repository of a unique talent, but as a person. He noticed the way she'd bite her lip when she was concentrating, the quiet, unshakable faith that informed her every decision, the deep, weary sadness that sometimes flickered in her eyes when she spoke of her mother. For Tanisha, the struggle was in navigating a world where her lived experience was both her greatest asset and her greatest liability. She was a woman from the streets, now trying to command a boardroom. She didn't have the corporate jargon, the polished presentations, or the easy, unearned confidence of her new colleagues. All she had was the truth. One afternoon, in a tense budget meeting, a senior executive dismissed her proposal to fund a mobile health clinic. The optics are good, but the ROI is a nightmare. It's a financial black hole. A woman who can't get to a doctor because she can't afford to miss a day of work isn't a financial black hole, Mr. Davis, Tanisha shot back, her voice ringing with a passion that silenced the room. She's a mother, she's a sister, she's a human being, and if this foundation isn't about that, then what in God's name is it for? Alistair, who had been sitting silently at the head of the table, looked from the executive's shocked face to Tanisha's, and for the first time he saw her not as an investment, not as a test, but as a conscience his company and he himself had been sorely lacking. He didn't say a word, but his decision was made in that instant. The fragile, tense, and deeply grudging respect was beginning to bloom into something far more dangerous, far more complicated, a genuine and deeply unsettling admiration. The success of Tanisha's first major project, the mobile health clinic she had fought for, was undeniable. It was a triumph not of spreadsheets, but of souls. The press, so long critical of the Finch Forward Initiative's detached corporate charity, loved it. They ran stories featuring Tanisha, the visionary new strategist with a heart for the people, and lauded Alistair Finch for his brilliant, compassionate new direction. For the first time in years, the ghost of his wife's criticism began to quiet in Alistair's mind. He was finally doing something she would have been proud of, and it was all because of Tanisha. His admiration for her, once a grudging respect, had deepened into something more profound. He found himself seeking out her opinion not just on the foundation, but on everything. Her quiet faith, her clear-eyed wisdom had become his new North Star. But in the world of billionaires, success is a magnet for enemies, and Alistair Finch had a rival who had been waiting for a moment of perceived weakness, a ruthless, old-money competitor named Julian Davenport. Davenport had lost a major city contract to Alistair a year prior and had been nursing a grudge ever since. He saw the glowing press about Tanisha not as a sign of Alistair's redemption, but as an opportunity. He saw a chink in the armor of the untouchable Alistair Finch. Davenport hired a private investigator, and the story was almost too easy to find. The desperate late-night plea for a loan, the strange, unorthodox consulting contract, the fact that Tanisha had, until 3 months ago, been the man's maid. The attack came in the form of a devastating, anonymously sourced article in a major San Francisco business journal. The headline was a masterpiece of character assassination. The Maid in the Boardroom, Alistair Finch's charity begins at home. The article was a vicious, condescending narrative that painted Tanisha as a brilliant, manipulative grifter who had concocted a sob story to prey on a reclusive, grieving billionaire. It framed her investment proposal as a laughable, desperate ploy. It implied a sordid, inappropriate relationship and questioned the suspicious timing of her mother's illness. It didn't just attack her competence, it attacked her character, her dignity, her very humanity. The story was a bombshell. The board of Finch Enterprises, which had been placated by the recent good press, was now in a full-blown panic. Whispers of undue influence, reputational risk, and erratic leadership began to fly. The foundation, which had just begun to heal its public image, was now the subject of a humiliating, salacious scandal. Alistair was in a state of cold, controlled fury. He knew this was Davenport's work, but the damage was done. He called an emergency meeting of his executive council. Tanisha was there, standing by his side, her face a mask of calm, dignified steel, but he could see the deep, profound hurt in her eyes. The meeting was a bloodbath. His most senior board member, a man named Henderson, laid it out in brutal, unequivocal terms. "Alistair, this is a catastrophe," Henderson said, his voice grim. "We are a multi-billion-dollar global corporation, and the narrative is that our philanthropic strategy is being dictated by your cleaning staff. This cannot stand. You have to cut her loose, immediately. Issue a statement, say it was a temporary, misguided experiment, and terminate her contract. It's the only way to cauterize the wound." Every head around the table nodded in agreement. They were circling the wagons, and Tanisha was on the outside. This was it, the ultimate choice. It was the moment where his old life, the world of cold, hard, logical business decisions, was in a direct, high-stakes collision with his new one, the world of faith, of trust, of a partnership he had come to value more than any deal. He looked at the stern, unforgiving faces of his board members, the men who had helped him build his empire. And then he looked at Tanisha. She was not looking at him with pleading eyes. She was looking at him with a quiet, unwavering strength, her gaze a silent testament to the dignity they were trying to strip from her. She was not asking him to save her. She was watching to see who he would choose to be. His past failure, the ghost that had haunted him for a decade, screamed in his ear, "Don't be a fool again. Don't let sentimentality blind you. Cut the risk." But the voice of his late wife and the new, stronger voice of his own reawakened conscience whispered something else. What is the point of an empire if you have to sacrifice your soul to keep it? Alistair Finch stood up, his movement commanding the silence of the room. He looked not at his board, but at Tanisha. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command that no one in that room had heard in years. "You seem to be under a misapprehension. Miss Williams's contract will not be terminated. In fact, it is being made permanent. As of this moment, I am appointing her to the board of the Finch Forward Initiative as its new executive director." A collective gasp went through the room. Henderson looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Furthermore," Alistair continued, his voice ringing with an absolute, unshakable authority, "I am calling a press conference for this afternoon, and I am going to tell the world the truth. Not the half-truths and vicious innuendo they have been fed, but the real story. The story of a desperate, proud, and brilliant woman who in her darkest hour had the courage to offer me not a plea, but a proposition that has done more to honor this company's legacy than any of you have in the last 5 years." He walked over to Tanisha and, in front of everyone, gently took her hand. It was a simple, profound, and public gesture of absolute solidarity. "Miss Williams is not a liability," he declared, his gaze sweeping the shocked faces of his board. "She is the single greatest asset this company has. And if any of you have a problem with that, your own resignations will be accepted, effective immediately." He had made his choice. He had not just defended her, he had chosen her. He had publicly, irrevocably, and gloriously championed her, risking his entire reputation on the quiet, dignified strength of the woman who had just a few months ago been cleaning his floors. He had finally walked through the fire. The press conference was a masterclass in controlled demolition. Alistair, with Tanisha standing calmly and confidently by his side, did not just refute the slanderous article, he eviscerated it. He told the entire unvarnished truth, from his own emotional detachment to Tanisha's moment of desperate, brilliant audacity. He didn't paint her as a victim he had rescued. He painted her as the visionary leader who had rescued his failing foundation. He took the narrative of the Maid in the boardroom and turned it into a powerful, inspiring, authentically American story of meritocracy. He championed her not as an exception, but as an example of the brilliant, untapped potential that the corporate world, in its arrogance, overlooks every single day. He ended the conference by announcing a multi-million-dollar expansion of the mobile health clinic to be personally overseen by its new executive director, Tanisha Williams. The effect was immediate and profound. The narrative didn't just die, it was reborn. The story of the manipulative maid was replaced by the story of the visionary director. Tanisha became a symbol of hope, of dignity, of the power of a good idea. Julian Davenport's vicious attack had backfired spectacularly, leaving him looking petty and foolish, while elevating Alistair and Tanisha to a new level of public admiration. That evening, the penthouse was quiet, but the silence was different. It was no longer the cold, empty silence of grief, but the warm, peaceful silence of a battle won, of a storm past. Tanisha stood by the vast window, looking out at the glittering lights of San Francisco, the same view Alistair had stared at for years. But she didn't see a cold, indifferent city. She saw a city full of possibilities, of communities to heal, of work to be done. Alistair came to stand beside her. For a long time, they just stood in a comfortable, shared quiet. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him, "for what you did today, for believing in me when the entire world was telling you not to." "I was not the one who took the risk today, Tanisha," he replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "You took the risk the day you walked into my study. You bet on yourself. I just finally found the courage to bet on you, too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, elegant box. "This is not a reward," he said quickly, a faint, rare smile on his face. "And it is not charity. It is the closing of a deal." She opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was not a piece of jewelry, but a single, beautifully crafted fountain pen, its nib made of gold, for the new executive director, to sign the contracts that will change the world. Tanisha laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that filled the vast room. She took the pen, her fingers closing around it. It felt solid, real, a symbol of a future she had earned. "I spoke to my aunt today," she said, her voice softening. "I told her my mother's treatments are fully funded for the next 2 years, thanks to the salary you've given me. She's responding well. The doctors are hopeful." The relief in her voice was a palpable, beautiful thing. "That is good news," Alistair said, his own voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. She finally turned to face him. "You didn't just save her life, Alistair. You gave me back my own." He looked at her, at this incredible, resilient, brilliant woman who had come into his life like a quiet storm, tearing down the walls of his grief and rebuilding his entire world. The partnership they had forged, born of a desperate proposition and tested by a public fire, had become the most important thing in his life. It was not yet a romance, but it was a profound, unbreakable bond of love and respect. It was a family. "No, Tanisha," he said, his voice a raw, heartfelt whisper as he gently took her hand. "You gave me back mine." They stood together by the window, their hands clasped, no longer two separate souls from two different worlds, but partners, looking out at the same city, ready to build a new, better legacy together.
She didn't ask for a handout. She demanded an opportunity. And in doing so, she didn't just save her mother. She saved a man's soul. This is the kind of story that reminds us that our true worth is not in our circumstances, but in our courage. If you believe in the power of a single voice to change the world, If you believe that dignity is a treasure that can never be bought or sold, then your subscription is a statement. It tells the world that these stories of quiet, powerful heroism need to be heard. Don't let that message go silent. See you in the next emotional story.